Today I'm making this beautiful sunflower mood lamp. Let's get into it. First step is the scoring and cutting of the glass. You can see I drew out the leaves patterns. I tend to not make everything identical, whether that's laziness or trying to make it look more natural. You can decide. Grinding everything to a shape I enjoy. It's one of the things about stained glass is the grinding process takes way longer than you might anticipate. Gotta be careful not to cut yourself in this glass. The edges are still incredibly sharp. At this point, I'm putting a bevel in on the edges of the petals on both sides. I do this because those sides are going to be fully exposed, meaning I'm not putting any copper foil on them. And so I don't want them to have a 90-degree edge. So this is what's going to turn into the base of the sunflower, where all of those green petals are going to be built off of, and then the yellow flower petals will be built off the other side. Trying to get a nice curve here so that I can house any sort of lighting that I want to use on the inside. You can see I've left a hole in the middle, and that's where the electricity will come in. I'm just going to put a tack solder piece on here so I can see how it all looks. Make sure I like the angle that it's at. Make sure there's enough concave space on the inside to fit the lights. There is a little bit of a gap there between some of those pieces of glass, but I'm just going to be filling that with solder, and it's going to be behind some green leaves, so you won't even notice that it's there. This copper piece is actually hollow on the inside, and so I'm going to solder this onto the base. Later on, once most of the soldering or all of the soldering is done, is when I'll put the electrical in. I don't want the heat from the copper to melt any of the electrical wires that I'm putting in there. So that's going to come at the end. For now, I'm just trying to get a base of the flower so that I can start building out the petals, building out the leaves, and turning it into the mood lamp. You can see the soldering job on that concave green part isn't perfect, but like I mentioned earlier, the leaves are going to be covering it completely, so you won't see those lines at all. And that's definitely something I can improve upon in my stained glass work, is taking the time to make those little things better. Even though it's going to be hidden, even though no one's ever going to see it, taking the time to make sure that those gaps are small, that the solder lines are clean, that's definitely something I need to work on. Apparently, I also need to work on figuring out how to position these little clamps to hold what I want. Although I want to work on making everything look perfect even when you can't see it, I'm still trying to put enough solder in there to hold everything firmly and securely so I can build a flower upon this base. And that's what it looks from the other side. You can see that hole in the copper. Now I'm gonna fire off those petals I was making earlier to give them various different curves. And well, I made a mistake. I fired it off without letting the clay fully dry. You can see this mold right here exploded in the kiln, throwing dust on all of the glass. I had multiple pieces explode in there. The other mistake I made is I actually fired it for far too long. You can see the glass lost its shape. It got so hot that it turned into a pool of molten glass, losing any sort of definition on the outside, and that's not something I necessarily want. I think I fired these ones for 13 minutes. So the next firing I did 11 and a half. It's a trial and error process, especially when you're using a kiln like I have that does not have specific temperature setting. So here I go, round 2. I would like to say I only made this mistake once, but I've made it before and I would probably make it again. Like I said, it's the issue with not having a temperature setting on my kiln. I just have to trial and error. I've also cut out and shaped the leaves that will go onto the stalk of the flower. Hopefully this time it doesn't explode. You can see I got a nice gentle curve on the leaves on the outside. And here I'm doing something a little experimental. I'm actually going to be cutting into the leaves on those Sharpie lines. The idea in my mind was that those lines would become like the veins of the leaves, giving it a little bit more of a dynamic feel than just a plain green leaf. I could go a little slower here and make sure that everything was perfectly symmetrical, but I was rushing for whatever reason, and maybe it just makes it look more natural. I don't know, you decide. I have to go very slow here. Use a lot of water, go very slow so that the glass doesn't crack. As you can see with the leaves that I made earlier, I'm not planning on covering the entire outside of this leaf, this larger leaf, I guess, with copper, just the insides. I've cut a couple notches and I have the copper wrapping around. With that wraparound, it still holds the glass incredibly well. And here you can see those leaves I was working on earlier, those smaller leaves. I only put that copper around about half of it, and there's little notches in there so that it doesn't fall off. And that's how they're gonna mount, is I'm gonna completely encase this thing in small leaves. And there you have it. Looks a little wild now, but once the yellow petals are on, it looks a lot better. I was a little disappointed that the light didn't shine through more, but you get what you get. And that's why it's a mood lamp instead of an actual lamp. And as you can imagine and as you saw, there's a lot of yellow petals that I need to make. And again, I could go slower, I could make these more symmetrical, more uniform. Part of me wanted them to be different, part of me wanted to go fast. I definitely need to slow down in these moments. I think my ideal is that each one is slightly different, but hold the same general shape. A few of the ones I made were slightly different in shape, and that was a little frustrating to me at the time. And that's where I could slow down and make sure that everything is in the same family of shape at least, and not a drastically different shape, even if they're slightly different. Like with the leaves earlier, I'm not going to copper around the entire petal. And in fact, I'm going to do something slightly different. And instead of doing a U shape at the bottom, I'm only going to do 2 small points on either side. I've cut a notch in there at an angle. And what happens is that copper feels incredibly loose. And even when I put the first piece of solder on, it feels loose. But once it's soldered to everything around it, it becomes much more rigid and solid. You can see those little indents that I've made where the solder is going to fill and hold everything tightly once everything is soldered together. On its own, it is still very flimsy and weak. Together, it is strong. And as you can imagine, I had dozens of these to make. You can see each one has a curve as well. Not shown here is the many firings I did for these petals. Some have a drastic curve, some are just slightly askew. Some are even straight. My idea with not doing the U at the bottom is I wanted the light to actually enter the glass from the side. It didn't quite happen that way, but it meant less solder on the inside, which means more light can escape. And I think that ended up working. It didn't work this way I wanted to, but it was a lesson for the next lamp I make. I'm gonna double layer these, give it more of a dynamic, three-dimensional look to it. It was definitely a game to make sure that each piece of solder on the petal had a contact point. You can see there creates a ring of solder at the top, and I'm gonna fill that with almost like a cover plate. That's the face of the flower, and it's gonna encompass that ring perfectly, or as close to perfect as I can make it. I'm using an LED strip so I can coil it around and send the wire down, and I've mounted it in that piece of brick. Here I am working on that final piece, that faceplate or face of the flower, where a lot of the light comes through. Putting in the final little pieces here, and this is what you get. It has a nice ambiance, a yellowish glow to it. So tell me what you think. Do you like this style of lamp? Would you even call this a lamp? Thank you for watching. Until next time, goodbye.